Since astrology is nothing other than cultural astronomy, let me remind you what these intense solar outbursts might mean, so hold on to your hats. As mentioned, in 2012 and 2013, we are experiencing massive solar flare eruptions on the surface of our sun. And even with all of this solar activity, I still manage to forget about the active sun and its intermittent messages to me at this peak time of the solar cycle. I'm too busy arranging the deck chairs of my life and trying to get all of my ducks in a row to remember that when the sun speaks, I must listen. We all must. And it is an inside listening and message, one that we can't help but hear because it interrupts what we ignorantly think of as our life. It's almost like the message we hear, we interrupt our regular programming to bring you the following special message. The sun does that for us. And I must admit that it's a little frustrating to have my regular life flow just overridden and made temporarily obsolete, while I stop to absorb something even more important. But it's a welcome relief over my own kind of meandering life plans. It would seem that the daily stream of astrological aspects from the sun, the moon, and the planets is interrupted by these intense solar outbursts. They simply override the standard astrology aspects in significance. It's something like that. And the life-saving grace of these powerful solar events is that they are more important. They do short-circuit all of my well-manicured plans, my life direction. They cut to its core and simply change the game without even notifying me. Rather, another way of putting it, solar flares are the notification of change. They're change itself, and ultimately they are a blessing. These intense solar events, they manage to overwrite my regular life with a kind of a priority message, one that I can't ignore because it is always more real than the life I like to think I'm now living. And these solar impulses, they come from within, from my very center, from a deeper place than I normally know, so therefore I can't help but listen. Solar information is life compared to the life I now am living. So I sometimes wonder, how can a message from deep within me come from something as distant as the center of the sun? Perhaps real depth, it's not measured by space or distance, but rather by who it is that is speaking, by the importance or size of the system, like something the size of the solar system, or even of the entire galaxy. Is what is nearest and dearest to my heart actually a message from the sun? Something so far away? In other words, does distance just not matter when it comes to the heart, to our core, to what's really important? Do time and space meet beyond time and space? I know this is getting philosophical. As mentioned, it seems to me, at least in my experience, that strong solar activity like solar flares and CME events trump the more standard astrological, the traditional indicators. This is like saying that the sun is bigger or more important than the planets that circle it. I guess that makes sense. I'm getting able to recognize these solar events, not by seeing them announced by scientists, but by feeling them happening inside me. For example, I had this experience this morning. I have not written any poetry for weeks, maybe months. And then I'm driving the backcountry roads to the grocery store, and a poem starts just to come into my mind unannounced. I jot it down on the grocery list, and when I get back home, I can't resist checking the website where they list solar activity. And sure enough, there was a strong solar flare and a corresponding CME event that took place earlier that morning. So what's this all about? When the sun speaks, do I write poetry? Does some inner part of me dance to the inner life of the sun? It would seem so. Since we are reaching the peak of an 11-year sunspot cycle, prepare to be interrupted a lot in 2012 and 2013. And these solar interruptions, they really are special. They change us from the inside out, with a change that wipes out who we thought we were and overwrites our memory with something new. It's like a firmware upgrade for your iPhone. We can't remember who we were before the overwrite because it's we that has changed. It would appear that in these months, that just as we start to get into the groove of our normal life flow, into some linear track or line of thought, a solar outburst interrupts our mind stream and train of events. Only in this case, the interruption itself is the life, and not what it interrupts. Solar flux is change itself, and it overwrites whatever we think we are doing, just like that. It's perhaps similar to the process of meditation, where at least it happens to me, where my attempts to practice meditating are occasionally interrupted by actual meditation. In other words, the interruption is what's important, and not what was going on up until then. These solar eruptions distract us from our day-to-day distractions, like the melody of a song is heard through the static noise of a bad radio. Our usual ramblings and distractions are punctuated by these intense solar events, which override by coming from a yet deeper source and center. In fact, it reminds me of the times when I think I want to put on some music and then realize I'm already listening to music. Something deeper wants to be heard, and with these solar events, we have no choice but to listen. The solar influx from flares and CME events can be likened to the floodplain of a river after inundation. In this case, by flooding our own known and familiar internal mental landscape with change. When the sun quiets down and the solar tides begin to recede, you might imagine that things would begin to look normal again, but that's not so. If you've ever seen a river or stream flood, when it recedes, things are not just as they were before. The flood tides remove things from one place and make new deposits in another. Often the course of the streambed itself is altered, and there's an entirely new channel. So it is with solar tides and their receding. As the sun quiets down for the moment, and life begins to return to normal, what we see is not what we remember. Things have changed, and often we can't even remember exactly how things were before the solar event began, because we have changed too. We not only see new landmarks, but we probably see with new eyes, because as often as not, it is we who have changed, not just our inner view or landscape. The object and subject here are interdependent. In other words, both our life landscape, that is our view, and how we see it has changed, which makes it almost impossible to compare or even remember how things used to be. With solar flares, we have experienced change at our core, and that kind of change changes our periphery, the outside, how we project. Very few people are aware of this kind of change, yet it happens all the time. We struggle even to get a glance at it. I hope you get the idea. There is an upside to when the solar tides recede, at least once we accept that we can't go back to where we once were, or even be sure who it was we were. and what we saw before all of this change. And the upside is a surge of what can only be called creativity. Perhaps it's just the discovery as we come back into our normal senses and can see more clearly again. In other words, as the solar tides recede and the solar flare fades, our mind clears so that we can begin to make out our inner landscape once again. We start to add up all the changes we see and form an impression of what has happened. Hopefully, it's more than an impression or a simple knowing that we have been through an experience. Our analytical faculties start to come back into play as we kind of get our arms around the whole recent experience. We begin to put it into some perspective, to see it from a distance. We start to get a handle on what we went through and begin to develop a new view, or at least some opinion of it. And this is where the creativity comes in. Of course, all of this is so very subtle. And if some of you are shaking your heads at what I say, I can only understand and apologize. This is something that most of us have to learn to be sensitive to. And for that to happen, you have first to hear about it. Some of you are hearing about it now and may, upon listening to it, develop some sensitivity down the road. As for the creativity, at the very least, we're forced to be creative as we try to patch together the Humpty Dumpty sense of ourself we find after solar influx, some of which may have been shattered or scattered through all the changes that we went through that are taking place. We gradually assume some semblance of a normal self once again. But there are usually, if we don't blindly ignore them, some gaps in our memory, gaps that belie the difference between what we were then, like before the flare, and what we are now. As I like to say to myself, we agree to forget what we find just too hard or painful to remember. We patch our self-image back together as best we can, and we just have to move on. If this sounds a little rough or down, it's nothing new. We're used to it. There's no explaining some of the anomalies we may come across, or the raw references to the past that we cannot totally resolve, because what we see has changed, how we see it, and even who it is that is doing the seeing. It does not just all add up. So we must just forget it and move forward with whatever self-assemblage we can live with, something we can stand to see in the mirror, so to speak, even if it is kind of a patchwork affair, and it often is. My point here is that when the sun speaks, we listen. And it's a little more personal than that. The injection of change into our life, in ourself, it's something that we have no choice about. It just comes. The kicker is that this change is an internal change, a change that affects us directly. In other words, we change. And here's what needs to be grasped by those of you viewing. We have no choice but to identify with the change that the sun brings, as opposed to continuing to identify with who we remember as ourselves before a solar flare. Because the sun, in fact, is our inner life in reality. The sun, in its changes, represents the truth of us. And unless we ignore the truth, we will find ourselves identifying with what the sun reveals as to who we are. Because of our ignorance, our tendency to ignore change and the truth, we can discover large gaps between what is being revealed by the sun to us in a solar flare and who we remember we are or think we are from the past. This is an age-old struggle between conservative and liberal, between the status quo and change. The sun is most liberal. It always brings change, and change changes what? Obviously, change changes the status quo by definition. When we grasp that fact, that it is our own identity that's changing, we're starting to get a handle on the problem. As I have written for decades, this process of identification, of putting the pieces of ourself back together after such a strong experience as a flare, is nothing more than the circulation of cosmic information that allows our universe to cohere and continue to exist. This identification, this identifying process is circulation. Whenever we identify with anything or anyone, and this concept is a big deal. When the sun begins to quiet down and shows no flares, it's at that point we have a chance to start to gather something, to make sense of any solar experience that just took place. And perhaps we can gain some distance and perspective from what we have been so wrapped up in during the flare. And this perspective itself is just a pause, because the solar flare season is never over and will not be over anytime soon. The sun is always relatively active. Yet we can come up for air. We can pull ourselves together long enough to look around and take notes. We can perhaps see something of what is happening with us, if we will look. Even as I record this, we're getting a break right now. It's a good time to look around. And depending on what we can see, again, if we'll look, this can be a very creative time. We can be aware of change as it happens, but we have to be aware enough to look. What happens to us at these times of solar inundation? Whether it be experiencing the full power of a CME, a coronal mass ejection, or the time around an eclipse, or just the monthly new and full moon. While I'm sure these events are to some degree personal, my guess is that because the sun is shared by everyone, how we take these experiences is more similar than not. By talking about it a bit here, perhaps more of us can recognize and become aware of just what is happening to us at these important times. Let me repeat something I've mentioned before in earlier writing about solar events, and that is, I have little to no idea of just how solar information works on our psyche, the mechanism, and neither does science, but I know that it does. We all know the effect of sunlight on our eyes and bodies, that it allows the eyes to work and makes things grow and bloom. Do we also bloom? My guess would be yes, but that would be another topic. What is it that moves us? We know that our brains and bodies are complex systems that the life force animates for a time and then abandons. But what about larger structures like the sun or our galaxy? Is the sun or the galaxy speaking to us? Astrophysicists speculate that in order to cohere, to remain coherent, even structures the size of the galaxy have somehow to keep informed, to keep updated. In other words, information of some kind circulates like a bloodstream through these large celestial systems. How this is done is not known, other than it is a fact that light and gravity waves travel long distances, and they may serve as information carriers. I'm not going to speculate here how that may work, although I have written about this since the 1970s. I will, however, introduce one key concept for you to consider as you can. We think about many kinds of things all the time. We entertain grand concepts like this one, the one I'm trying to lay out here. But we seldom examine the building blocks of our language. Take the concept of identification. And I don't mean the identification of a butterfly or an object. I'm talking about self-identification. What is it that happens when we personally identify with someone or something? What's the process in the moment of identification? The spark that illumines the mind when we identify? That's a rhetorical question, but I'm going to try to answer it. I've come to believe that the process itself of identifying, of identification, is the circulation of information, and perhaps cosmic information at that. After all, We are smack dab in the middle of the cosmos right now, so all information is cosmic information, right? Every time we personally identify, something special happens. I like to say identification, the process, is circulation of cosmic information. That's the concept I would have you consider. Identification, the process of identifying. When we identify or say, aha, that's how the psyche or the self knows itself. And what's knowing? What is it to know something or someone? As you can see, these basic language words themselves need refreshing through examination at least every once in a while. I won't push the concept here, but suffice it to say that I believe that the process of identification, of identifying, is how the universe circulates information, and that we are not only gelatinous blobs, but also an integral part of universal consciousness in circulation, so that it can know itself, so that we can know ourself and continue to cohere and exist, so we all can know ourselves. The universe knows itself through us, or to put it in a better way, we are universal consciousness knowing itself. As I like to say, we are the intelligent life that scientists are looking for out in the universe. We have been trying to find ourselves forever. We are ourselves, the being from outer space that we seek, because we're already in outer space, and we've always been there.